Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're around the globe. I'd like to welcome you to the third panel of 50 years in Bretton Woods. And this panel will focus on what has research learned and how the end of Bretton Woods affected research. And to discuss this, we have 4 panelists, and I'll just briefly tell you about the rules of engagement. So each panelist will speak for something around 10 minutes. This will be followed by a moderated discussion and a Q&A. If you have questions as the speakers, as the panelists speak, please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Enter the questions, and we'll field them after we have all 4 panelists have completed their first intervention. So we'll hold on to the questions until then. Without further ado, let me start by introducing our panelists. So we're happy, glad, and I'll do the order of presentations, to have with us Maury Obstfeld from UC Berkeley, who is also the chief economist of the IMF. We have Atish Ghosh from the IMF. We have Beatrice Cherrier from the Ecole Polytechnique, and Giancarlo Corsetti from the European University Institute in Florence. So these are our distinguished panelists, and I'm Nathan Sussman. I'll be your moderator this evening from the Graduate Institute. So without further ado, let me pass the ball to Maury, who's going to kick off this panel. So the floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here 50 years later. And let me share my screen with you. Pondering the topic of this conference, 10 research legacies from the end of the Bretton Woods period occurred to me. If you look at the history, these were really momentous years in many ways. So I'm sure there are many other issues people could raise, but let me run through what I was able to come up with. One prime area for research progress has been in the understanding of speculative attacks on fixed exchange rate regimes. Literature started with Paul Krugman's 1979 first generation model, progressed through second generation models with multiple equilibria based on government actions, third generation models with multiple equilibria based on financial frictions. A second area that has lived on in the modern international monetary system is the Triffin dilemma. Initially, it referred to the ability of the US to redeem dollar reserves in gold at $35 an ounce, given the tremendous growth in global dollar reserves and limited gold availability. In more recent years, it's referred to the desire of the world's central banks to accumulate safe dollar assets, namely treasury liabilities, and the possibility that those supplies might be limited. But this is an aspect of the global monetary system that has come back in another form. We talked about exorbitant privilege in the 60s, the privilege of the United States to set monetary policy and to finance its balance of payments deficits by issuing dollars. This has morphed into the ability of the US to finance current account deficits more cheaply, to borrow more cheaply. There are different versions of this, and there's even a concept of exorbitant duty, which is why I kind of ask, qu'est-ce que c'est? I think it's a little bit ill-defined, but relates to the position of the dollar at the center of the world system, something that is not changed materially in 50 years. Related is the issue of international liquidity, the lender of last resort, swaps, which actually began in the Bretton Woods period and now take a different form. The role of the IMF, which has evolved with the demise of the fixed exchange rate system, but is still central to the global financial safety net. Capital controls were deployed in the Bretton Woods system to prop up the fixed exchange rate system, most notably to repel inflows. Look at Switzerland, look at Germany. But this is a topic that has remained very current, particularly as emerging markets have grown and participated more fully in international financial markets. And the IMF is currently reviewing its doctrine on capital controls. And we've had an outpouring of theory, of research on the relationship between capital controls and macroprudential policy and the like that has been one of the richest areas of research. The fixed exchange rate system of Bretton Woods raised the question of the trilemma, the role of capital controls, the ability to carry out an independent monetary policy, and more fundamentally of the role of exchange rates in international adjustment. The trade elasticity, the role of the exchange rate with different invoicing patterns has remained quite relevant, quite hotly debated. But a new element of this debate has come with the explosion of financial markets after the demise of Bretton Woods, and the question of trilemma versus dilemma, the global financial system, and the ability of exchange rates to insulate national economies, something that was touted by some economists toward the end of the Bretton Woods period, but something that remains an active area of research. 1971 was the year the US went off gold, and we can debate when effectively the gold standard collapsed. Was it before then? I would say yes, but it did raise the issue of the nominal anchor. If gold is not the nominal anchor, with the dollar pegged to gold and currencies pegged to the dollar, what becomes the nominal anchor? That uncertainty was certainly manifest in the 70s, the decade after the demise of Bretton Woods and the high inflation that broke out then. That, of course, is very relevant today, especially when we think about alternative currencies like Bitcoin, not issued by national governments. And also relevant today, as we look out the window, is the economics of supply shocks. The end of Bretton Woods was followed very quickly by the OPEC shock, probably not unrelated to the inflation of the time and the dollar instability of the time. And just look in today's papers, I mean, literally today, and you will see commentary on whether central banks, notably the Fed, where the FOMC is meeting, should look through supply shocks or worry about the extent to which they get incorporated into expectations. The euro dates from this period as well, as exchange rate instability roiled the markets. Countries in Europe desired tighter relationships between their cross exchange rates. They created the snake. The Werner Report was issued in October 1970, setting out a blueprint for a phased achievement of monetary union by 1980. Didn't happen, but by 1999, it did. And there's been obviously a huge amount of research on monetary union, its fiscal aspects, the optimum currency area question, and the like. And finally, my 10th topic may seem a little bit out of left field, but remember that it was in 1972 that President Nixon went to China, and that the process of reintegrating China into the global political and economic system began. The amount of research related to China's growth and entry into the world economy, not only about China itself, but about its effects on other countries, is massive. And so I think one could not talk about the legacies of Bretton Woods without mentioning China's emergence at that very moment. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Maury, for giving us this detailed survey of the development solution, also sticking to the 8 minutes precisely. So we move on to Rex, Atish, Ghosh. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. And let me just start by congratulating the organizers on, I think, a superb series of discussions on the international monetary system and under floating exchange rates. So I was asked to say a few words about how thinking at the IMF changed with the move to generalized floating in the early 70s. And I would say at the outset that the fund approached this subject very gingerly, very hesitantly. Of course, as an institution, it was set up to run the fixed exchange rate world. So when floating exchange rates came along, it was kind of a shock for us. At first, the thinking was, well, we could allow wider margins around the central parities. Then the fund spent a lot of time coming up with its guidelines on floating, which was a sort of de facto recognition of floating, but not a de jure recognition. And the de jure recognition only comes with the Second Amendment in basically in 1978. So if we think of the fund does 3 main activities, one is surveillance, the second is lending, and the third is technical assistance. So of course, TA is not relevant to discussion. So let me just focus on lending and surveillance for a moment. On lending, I would say that very little changed in terms of the IMF's operations with the move to floating exchange rates. And if you think about it, if you really took floating exchange rates seriously, you wouldn't need foreign reserves, and therefore you wouldn't need the IMF to lend you foreign reserves. So we wouldn't have a lending function if countries were happy with their exchange rates completely freely floating. And the whole kind of mechanism around lending, for example, a net domestic asset ceiling, net international reserves floor, is very much a fixed exchange rate world thinking. So I think on lending, very little changed at the fund with the move to floating. It's on the surveillance side that the major changes happened. And I think it's worth contrasting the thinking that was behind the original Article 4 of the IMF and the new Article 4, which comes into being in 1978. So, of course, coming out of the interwar period, the Bretton Woods conference, the kind of lesson that the founders of the fund took was that competitive devaluations and exchange rate instability had contributed to the interwar chaos, and that countries would be tempted to undertake competitive devaluations, and so they must be prevented from doing so. So basically, under the original Bretton Woods agreement, IMF members had to peg their currencies to either the dollar or to gold, and were only allowed to change the parity in the face of fundamental disequilibrium. And the IMF would provide short-term balance of payments financing so that they could ride out temporary shocks without undertaking devaluations. And the system, in a sense, obviated the need for policy coordination, or it wasn't very clear you needed policy coordination, or there was some coordination outside the IMF through the BIS, OECD, and G10. So with the collapse of Bretton Woods, there was a kind of new thinking evolved, and which said, and is really associated particularly with the Americans, who said, look, fixing the exchange rate doesn't bring stability, it brings rigidity. And short-term fluctuations are much better than these persistent misalignments followed by traumatic balance of payments crises. And so to get a stable system, what we really want is coherence between domestic monetary and fiscal policies and the exchange rate regime. And essentially, as long as domestic policies are geared towards what we call domestic stability, in other words, low inflation and orderly, steady growth, the exchange rate will endogenously be stable, regardless of whether you have a floating exchange rate or a fixed exchange. So there's still some concern about competitive devaluations or competitive depreciations or deliberate undervaluations. And this is contrasted with the French perspective at the time of the Second Amendment, which was, no, we should restore the fixed exchange rate world of Bretton Woods with some adjustments. So the new Article 4 that the IMF comes up with is a compromise between these two very different views on what would lead to a stable system. And the Article 4, I'll just mention two clauses of it. One says that each member shall avoid manipulating its exchange rate to gain an unfair competitive advantage. And each member shall endeavor to direct its economic and financial policies toward the objective of fostering orderly economic growth with reasonable price stability. So that's the American view, that as long as your domestic policies are geared towards domestic stability, exchange rate stability will emerge kind of endogenously. And Article 4 also mandates the IMF to do a couple of things. One is to oversee the international monetary system, but also to exercise firm surveillance over exchange rate policies. It's not mandated to exercise firm surveillance over domestic policies. So the point is that even though we move to a world of floating exchange rates, there is this kind of exchange rate bias in the IMF Articles of Agreement that persists in two senses. First, countries are required to avoid manipulating their exchange rate, but they need only endeavor to direct their domestic policies towards domestic stability. And the IMF is required to exercise firm surveillance over exchange rate policies, but not over domestic policies. So, that's partly because of the legacy of Bretton Woods, where we come from, this world in which we are overseeing exchange rates and exchange rate policies. And we have not fully embraced the fact that under a floating exchange rate, what matters is your monetary and fiscal policies. You don't, in fact, even have exchange rate policies. So there were a couple of occasions in which the IMF has tried to redress this asymmetry. Once in 2007, when basically the emerging markets opposed that initiative because they didn't want the IMF meddling in their domestic policies. And again in 2012, when it was actually the advanced economies that opposed this initiative, particularly Germany, for example. Germany did not want the IMF telling it that it should reflate its fiscal policy to help other Euro area members. So Germany said, well, wait a minute, fiscal policy is a domestic policy. So as long as we are directing it towards domestic stability in Germany, the IMF shouldn't be telling us what to do. So this has some implications. For example, when QE happened and there were large capital flows to emerging markets that were to some degree disruptive, IMF surveillance could not really tell the US that it shouldn't be doing QE because, again, QE was a domestic monetary policy directed towards domestic stability in the United States. So the spillovers from it were not really an appropriate subject of IMF surveillance. And even today, you know, when we're thinking about climate change mitigation versus climate change adaptation policies, well, adaptation, okay, but mitigation, no, because, you know, climate change policies are domestic policies, and so they don't really fit under the remit of IMF surveillance. All right, so sorry, that was a fairly legalistic discussion, but let me stop there and, you know, happy to talk more about sort of the economic implications.
Thank you, Rex. So move to Beatrice Cherrier, please.
All right, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for having me. So I'm not a historian of international economics. I'm a historian of applied economics and macro. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to consider the end of Bretton Woods as a kind of history shock that may affect some aspects of economic research. So I'm going to focus on academia because Atish talk about the IMF. And I asked three questions. First, did the end of Bretton Woods affected theoretical work, and how, then whether it affected empirical research, and then whether it affected the boundaries between international economics and other fields. And since I'm not a specialist, I have more questions than comments or conclusion for one. So in terms of theoretical works, you know, when you're actually trying to get a picture of a whole field, when you're a historian of economics, what you can do is do some quantitative work. So we did some. You're gonna actually map all the papers that are referenced in terms of international economics, international macro with GL codes, and try to find out which paper are more coincided with each other in every decade. And it's clear that in the 70s, the most two coincided papers with others, international economics papers are Cooper and Dornbusch, and very quickly onwards, Frankel kind of papers. So, so of course, sort of Bretton Woods came as a shock. But there is one question on whether there were more continuities than breaks in terms of theoretical work. Think in terms of topics. I mean, there's always been lots of discussion on exchange rate system, even before Bretton Woods. I mean, from the viewpoint of academia, there was a lot of discussion, though it was the emphasis went on managing the current account. It was carried more in institutional style than like formalized style, even by the people who actually had sort of formal models. Think about Friedman, think about Mead, think about Rueff and Triff in opposition to the gold exchange standards, think about Haberler as well. So there was lots of discussion about exchange rate regime at that point. So it was for the topic. The language in which lots of academic reaction to Bretton Woods was carried was also here before, and it was essentially brought by Mundell. I mean, his models actually, so remember, as Atish said, economists emerged from the interwar thinking sort of like floating exchange rate and capital movement and speculation was evil. And what Mundell's work did was basically creating some space to discuss this issue in a more analytical framework. And so it sort of brought some scientific legitimacy to other institutional arrangements other than Bretton Woods by modeling them into being in a tractable way. So that was for the language, and think in terms of then how you wrote models of international economics and discussed the exchange rate in the 70s and 80s. Here, the rule of the game were not drawn by Bretton Woods. They were the same for the whole economics profession. So basically what you had to do if you wanted to have an impact on the academic conversation from the 70s and 80s was writing a kind of workhorse models that would be more and more dynamic, that would be micro-funded, that would take into account expectations in the 70s, and that would take into account non-convexities like imperfect competition in the 80s. Okay, and certainly Bretton Woods the end of Bretton Woods actually vindicated the practice of writing models with flexible price to some extent. So this became how you would think about any basically economic issues, not just international macro. So there is the question of whether Bretton Woods actually sort of was a break in terms of theoretical thinking about international macro. I think it was actually more a break in terms of empirical work. Why? Because you can consider it as a huge data shock in terms of empirical international economics. When you look into, as I said, the most co-cited papers in international economics in the 70s, it's still a theoretical paper. From the 80s onward, it's more Hansen paper on forward exchange rate as optimal predictor for future spot rate, work by Engel, work by Hodrick, work by Mark, and that kind of stuff. So certainly Bretton Woods actually created a data shock for international econometrization. I'll come back and sort of created a whole field of sort of like applied international economics tied to finance. But one thing it also did is providing new stylus facts. And I think this is kind of important, like exchange rate facts about exchange rate volatility and so forth. And in doing so, it sort of created a whole lot of empirical puzzle. And think about a volatility puzzle, home bias kind of puzzle and whatsoever. And this puzzle, they sort of reacted back onto theoretical work, because these models, stochastic, dynamic, with rational expectation, they could not explain all the puzzles. So the puzzle could also be explained by writing models with friction, with rigidities, with price stickiness, like Dornbusch was. And from there, you get that sort of like schizophrenia in the profession with these two kinds of models that sort of converge into the 90s toward a sort of synthesis. I'm talking about the Obstfeld-Rogoff kind of model. And the third aspect of this sort of data shock that Bretton Woods brought was a new economic history experience that you could compare with the interwar. Here, I don't have a firm conclusion. My question is whether they sort of created special relationships between theory, empirical work, and economic history in international economics. I don't have an answer to that. And finally, there's the question: did the end of Bretton Woods sort of change the relationship between international economics and other fields? Of course, one big question is whether it changed the relationship between international economics and macroeconomics. If you look at that co-citation network in the whole of macroeconomics, what you see through time is international economics being on the fringe in the 60s and 70s and gradually moving to the center of macro as decade proceed. There suggests a greater coming together of macro and international economic questions, of course, because because of Bretton Woods, you had to study the transmission of monetary shock, to study the interrelationship of real and nominal variable more closely. So if I am to caricature what happens, before Bretton Woods, Mundell brought macro consideration into international economics. But with the end of Bretton Woods, what you had to do is basically bringing international economic consideration more systematically into macro. That's one way of seeing that. Two other fields that you could consider is a relationship between international economic and finance. One puzzle for historians of economics is how finance and macro for decades actually seem to live their separate lives. And I mean, the topic were the same, but they were publishing in different journals. Even in central banks, you often had like two research groups that were not always talking to each other until pretty late. And one question I have is whether it was different in international economics, or whether you had that two groups researching exchange rate, more macro and more finance, that were separated. I don't know. And the last question is, which I don't have any answer to, is whether the end of Bretton Woods, because it sort of asked question about international cooperation arrangement, created a specific relationship between international economic and political economy. So that would be it.
Thank you, Beatrice. And now we go to the fourth panelist, Giancarlo.
Hello, thank you for inviting me, and hello everybody. So let me start in a non-ritual way. I hope I'm not doing a disservice to Maury Obstfeld, but he told me that he developed his interest in international economics as a student of math in Cambridge, when he experienced the disruptions associated with the sterling devaluation in the 70s. So why was the exchange rate moving so dramatically? How the currency crisis related to economic policy or high tolerance for inflation? So the collapse of Bretton Woods perhaps lost a promising mathematician, but definitely, created a very influential great economist for international. This is a compliment for Maury, but it is not orthogonal to what I want to say, because it is, I was thinking, is the end of Bretton Woods a break, a lab experiment, where all of a sudden we look at freeing capital mobility or freeing countries to choose their own preferred exchange rate and monetary regimes. But really, this is a policy choice. It is not a shock, and it is a process. Like Bretton Woods may have started to die much before the 70s, and perhaps is still around in many ways. And in particular, it's still around the basic question, which is how we can manage capital mobility, misalignment, and imbalances across borders to achieve macroeconomic and financial stability. The previous panelists have said this. And this is particularly difficult in a world where different countries can choose different monetary and currency regimes, but all coexist around the monetary and financial hegemon, the US. So this is the policy framework before Bretton Woods, coming out, from the collapse of Bretton Woods, and still with us. So about the international economist, I would like to just add a note to what Beatrice also was saying, is that by and large, international economists never lost, for lack of a better expression, a Keynesian perspective. So we always had the idea that you need to build stable system by looking at the evolution of economic, technological, social fundamentals. Most of us have a healthy degree of skepticism about the equilibrating properties of markets. And most of us think that it's important to understand how to foster cooperation and multilateralism through resilient international institutions. So in a way, as a group, most of us are still born and bred in the intellectual debates of Bretton Woods. So let me do a quick, for lack of time, comment on two key directions of theoretical work coming out of the policy problems that I just defined. The first one, international economists always sort of had a workhorse model for theoretical research and policy advice. These two things were always together. And the second thing is that we really needed to understand better monetary instability in terms of currency and inflation, and in terms of currency and inflation and debt sustainability and default. So I'm not going to repeat the unbeatable list of Maury, but I just want to focus on these two elements. The first one is that demand and Fleming, as a workhorse, served well the profession maybe during Bretton Woods. But remember, despite being born from the intuition of Mead, in the discussion to Mandel, that he needed to bring capital mobility and macro into the model, Mandel-Fleming is not a good model for capital mobility. We attach an interpretation of capital mobility in the model, but there is no capital mobility in the model. One has to go to Tobin and Braga de Macedo, which is by and large, very difficult to read and not very practical for policy analysis. Second, there is no welfare analysis there. So it was difficult to use the workhorse model to guide the choice between exchange rate regimes. What are the merits and the cost of exchange rate regimes using the workhorse model? So I think, if I remember well, the evolution, the new paradigm, the Obstfeld model came out a little bit ahead of the closed economy model in terms that the norm, the new open macroeconomics, emphasized that the new paradigm did not have to do away with the financial and nominal frictions implicit in Mundell-Fleming. No, they did not need to do away with the theoretical debates and policy debates of the Mundell-Fleming. But it could bring in welfare analysis, right? To a consistent model for theory, empirics, and welfare analysis. So I'm not sure, I have to say, under the close scrutiny of Rudi Dornbusch, the agenda took off in the 90s, right? And it became dominant. I'm not sure that actually Maury and Maury also and Kerogov really liked the direction where they went. For a few reasons, I may guess. Let me do a guessing exercise. The first one is that those are models that put too much emphasis on the disutility of labor. So terms of trade, movement are very important in those models, more than people may think is correct. And second, despite the progress, capital flows are still not fully integrated in the model. And one of the theoretical challenge of Bretton Woods is how we think of monetary, financial, macro stability in a world with capital flows that are, by the way, much larger. They became much larger than many people anticipated, especially the Europeans. I don't think the Europeans, when they did the euro, Werner thought that capital flows would be as large as they are now. I just want to, without repeating what it was said, one thing that actually, the real divide of fields is actually international macro finance and trade. This is something that, to do policy advice, if we cannot understand how trade liberalization and capital account liberalization interact, if we cannot understand, so why do we have a single money for Europe, that comes with a single market, right? We don't have good theoretical foundations for that. And a new workhorse model for international, perhaps that is the frontier. There are a couple of things that also are frustrating in the new literature. The first one is that we like to think of analysis of, we like to think of the world with analysis of financial frictions, but the paradigms we have, the models still predict too much resharing. Those models, not only that they cannot include capital flows, but they also predict allocations that are very close to a complete market allocation. And we have been struggling to move away from, to give the model a chance to predict a different world. And so this is actually a big issue that we have. The second issue is that the end of Bretton Woods was also the end of a regime of implicit cooperation. And the new model struggled to single out what would be a positive, resilient, effective cooperation. We have all these results where between cooperation and Nash, a strategic interaction, or the famous comparative evaluation may actually not be a problem at all according to the model. But there are many ways in which policy making may be disruptive across borders. Our models are still not there. So I think I've exhausted my time. I'm just saying that one of the big challenges to international economists is to replace Mundell-Fleming with a workhorse model where, as international economy, we can do theoretical, empirical, and policy analysis together. Just one comment on the nominal stability. I think the high debt that we live through sort of call us to rethink the work by Krugman by Obstfeld, by other people, first, second, third generation model of currency and price instability, with the work done, for example, by Calvo, Eaton Gersowitz on debt sustainability, especially in places like Europe, where clearly the issue is the role of the central bank in intervening and keeping nominal debt more or less shielded from market vagaries. If you want to include an element of non-defaultability against the self-fulfilling crisis. All this should sort of call us for a systematic rethinking of this interconnection between nominal stability and possibility of debt restructuring and default once, not only we issue debt in a different currency, but also the central banks may be reluctant to sustain a stable financial market for government debt. I stop here.
Well, thank you, Giancarlo. Thank you all for sticking up the time. So, as planned, let's start by maybe a short moderated discussion. I've prepared a couple of questions, and then we move to the Q&A from the audience. So, which at the moment I see the Q&A slot box is empty. So I've prepared a couple of questions for this moderated discussion. So first of all, again, some anecdotes. I'm not as long as Giancarlo was talking about anecdotes from his from Maury's undergraduate study. So when I was doing my undergraduate, so international economics was just trade, and there was no textbook, nothing on the international economy, obviously, and that thing has changed. Coming from the perspective again of an economic historian who worked on financial economic history, so I think the gut reactions of most economic historians in the 70s and maybe even the early 80s when I was writing my dissertation is to view the departure from a gold standard or some kind of an anchor as a temporary thing. It's an emergency situation, it's a temporary, and a lot of research went back and looked whether the gold standard had some kind of a mythical quality to it that we should all return to. Is it all temporary? So there was a lot of studies not looking necessarily at the flexible exchange rate regime examples in history that are relatively few, but looking at the fixed exchange rate regime and trying to see what's the magic there and should we go back to it or not. So I think that's kind of how things evolved from my own personal perspective doing research at that time with respect to the collapse of Bretton Woods. But obviously 50 years later, it's no longer a short period that we can discuss as temporary. It's definitely a new regime, and I guess the research responded. So I have a couple of questions. One may be a little bit more specific, and then I have another one which is a little bit more broad. But the first specific one is that, as Beatrice was saying, and I think Maury, it was only in the beginning of your list to some extent. So the initial impact, I think, of the move of the collapse of Bretton Woods was the emergence or reemergence of this monetary approach to balance of payments coming from Andrew Johnson, Franco, people in Chicago, and this thing kind of pretty much exhausted itself after not a very long time, and I don't know if we teach those things anymore to our grad students. So one reflection, if you can. From the panel is why has that happened? Why? And I know Michael Musa at the IMF wrote about it and had a big thing about it. So at the time, so why is this thing kind of disappeared and in what sense it evolved? Another thing closely related is the rational expectations revolution. That obviously, if you're living under this fixed exchange rate regime, gold standard, everything's fixed. So, I mean, there are rational expectations, maybe in game theory and stuff, but you don't care about it that much in economics, in the macro economy. And I think that kind of revolution was also enabled in some sense with the move to this flexible exchange rate regime with no anchor initially until we got to the inflation targets in the late 80s or early 90s, basically allowed this whole strand of literature and rational expectations to evolve. And again, this is something that's already embedded in models, but again, what has happened since? And so this is kind of two developments that I thought coming incidentally from Chicago, that could interest the audience. If I can have your views about that, just a quick round. So I don't know who wants to begin. Let's go in the order that in the reverse order now. So we start with Giancarlo and with Maury.
You want to start with me? I just make a comment on rational expectation. Sure. I mean, like the again, nominal instability was a challenge. So in a way, you can have rational expectation models also for fixed exchange rate. Actually, the collapse of fixed exchange rate is an exercise in anticipation and rational expectation. What was interesting there, in my view, was the fact that there was this, referring to what Rex was saying, Rudy Dorbush really thought of offering a model where internal stability, so the overshooting model is basically a model explaining exchange rate variability with monetary policy in a way. So once you iron out monetary policy, you make it more, in a rational expectation way, you get more currency stability. So there's the link between domestic and I'm not sure that that explanation holds the test of time in the sense that, I guess this is a point also made by the literature that after inflation targeting, exchange rate variability remain high. So yes, it is there, especially for speculative attack, for financial, the international finance. Let me just add, maybe what also is it would be good to have a little bit more research is portfolio diversification, portfolio allocation from Penticuri and early literature on. I'm not sure that is really rational expectation headline. It would be more about a model with stock and flows. International is a place really badly needing a model of stock and flows.
Thank you. Beatrice?
Maybe we want to hear the person who actually contributed to that literature first. So perhaps, yeah, Maury Obstfeld.
Yeah, so Maury.
Okay, I'll go out of order. On the rational expectations issue, I think this really grows out of the Phelps-Friedman version of the Phillips curve, and that was a theoretical insight that became very salient with the spike up in inflation in the 70s, and that really brought expectations to the fore. And I think rational expectations was a natural development, which then found its way into the open economy framework. And I think basically Rudy's overshooting paper was one of the first to incorporate it, although Stan Black actually did very important early work, and Rudy thanks Stan Black for his suggestions in the paper. So I don't want to get into the the attribution issue, but the monetary approach, that's a super interesting question. In fact, it is still thought that something like the monetary approach could be useful in countries with very underdeveloped financial markets, and is believed by some in the fund to be the case. But one thing that I didn't go into in detail because it's too big a topic, but that certainly Beatrice and Giancarlo alluded to, is just the explosion of financial deregulation, international and domestic, after the end of Bretton Woods. Now, the political economy of that is very fascinating, but I think one of the things it did is to sort of blur the lines of what is money, what is not money, and also as I said, bring in this issue of nominal anchor and the sort of tying down the price level, which turns out to be a very deep issue. I mean, we deride Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies for their instability, but the issue of government issued fiat monies remains hotly debated. And there are those who say, well, without fiscal policy, the government budget constraint, there's no nominal anchor. So I think it was natural to sort of de-emphasize money, but it leaves us in this very odd position that we're clearly interested in the exchange rate. The exchange rate is accepted to be the nominal or the relative price of monies, but we don't really know what monies are other than these these units that are created and managed by central banks. I'll just say in terms of the general macro literature that one way that I understand it is as a way of the evolution is a way to sort of get away from money. So in the early 80s, we had the real business cycle literature, which basically took the position that we don't really need to talk about money to explain anything, right? We can just forget about money, and everything is real, and we can replicate the main macro moments in a real model, and so never mind. Of course, that you can only push that so far, but then when you get to the sort of Clarida, Gali, Gertler, Woodford, science of monetary policy approach, they get rid of money too, in the sense that there's an interest rate rule. The central bank realistically sets a policy rate, and money demand, well, money supply, whatever that is, adjusts endogenously to equal money demand, whatever that is, in the background. But we never have to confront the issue of what actually is money, which is kind of a major question that you would have to answer to implement the monetary approach. So at some level, given the difficulty of answering that question, it's not really surprising that these approaches went, as useful as they might be for an earlier era, an era in which they were developed by not only Johnson and Mundell, but Jacques Pollock at the fund. They might have been useful once, but they don't tell us much in an economy, which, as Giancarlo hinted, is one where there are many assets, there are imperfect substitutes. They may be denominated in a unit of account managed by the central bank, but what is money supply, what is money demand may not be central to those issues.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the panel on this? Beatrice, yeah. You give up. You can now reclaim it.
Exactly. Yeah, so coming from a history of macro background, the question, I would frame the questions that your question about why the success and why the demise of the sort of like Chicago approach or Frankel approach, if you will, then the question is whether you had that sort of like, fresh water, salt water, also phenomena or competition or whatsoever, also in international macro. I'm not sure about like, you say that approach become exhausted. Maybe it's sort of like, it sort of became established methodologically, but lost in terms of substance. That would be a way to explain it. And as I said, as a presentation, my own way of rationalizing it is that, well, it came from a tool shock. I mean, the Carnegie tradition, Boltzmann mathematics, translated from triaging models, and everyone suddenly was doing some sort of like dynamics, rational expectation stuff because they had the tool to do so, and it was new. So it came from there, but this model, they could not explain any important stylized facts. I mean, they were having a volatility that were much lower than what you were observing. They were much more investment in foreign assets in this model that they were in fact, and at some point you had to turn to other solutions to actually make sense of it. And Don Bush was like, okay, if I reintroduce rigidities, which this Chicago people don't like, in the models, at least I have a rational, that overshooting rational for what we observed. And in that sense, that post-Bretton Woods era that brought sort of all this satisfact act as a sort of disciplining and pinning down where you want to go with these models, and you don't just want to go where these new techniques lead you. So that would be my way of rationalizing.
Rex, you want to add to this? Yeah, I see your hand up.
Just briefly, so I used to joke that, in the 60s and 70s, international finance people, created these barriers to entry by, their terminology, the monetary approach, the balance of payments. It turned out to be an inverted money demand function. But, and in fact, there was a Chicago, Geneva axis of people, people like Alexandre who participated in that. And, it was a very different discipline from macro or from trade. And then kind of in the early 80s, with the rational expectations revolution, most of the international macro models just became identical to macro models, except there were twice as many variables, half of which had stars. And that was, a kind of a description of that. But I think that, leading up to this, as Bretton Woods was collapsing, there were two diametrically opposite schools of thought, right? So the official sector thought it'll be a disaster if we go to floating exchange rates. And then some of the academics, particularly Friedman, said, no, it'll be much better. That exchange rates will move, to offset trade imbalances, and we'll get a much more stable system. And then it turned out both sides were wrong. It was neither a disaster, but clearly exchange rates moved way more than could be justified by trade patterns. And that, I think, was what sparked the interest in building in rational expectations models where future events and news can move the exchange rate today, which was a key insight, and why we have more volatile exchange rates than actual events of the day. And then like the Dornbusch model and others that build in greater volatility. So I think that's where the kind of discipline ended up, and of course it's continued from there. Let me just end there.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have a final kind of trick question that you can answer or prefer not to answer, but so surveying this whole development, that the research development in economic models and empirical work following Bretton Woods, this regime we're living in, what would you say, what is in your opinion, the most important research insight that we gained from this period? And if you have to select one, I know Maury had a list of 10, but I'm forcing you to select one. And which was the one you would think has the most gravitas here? And perhaps which one, or if it's not the same one, would be the most useful in dealing with the current situation that we're facing with the war, with the supply shocks, with the pandemic, the return of inflation, etc. And also what seems to be a short-term phenomenon, this financial, I would say warfare, which is going on in terms of capital flows, access to liquidity, central bank reserves, etc. So trying to bring it, the research insights into the modern, into the current arena, if you can entertain that. So I don't know who wants to start, or I should go with the reverse order again and start with Rex and Giancarlo. What's it? I can't hear you, Giancarlo.
Let's do the order of the panel this time.
Okay, so do the order. So we start with Maury, and you go last.
I think about it.
Yeah, you want to think about it. Okay.
Well, I don't know that I would want to identify a single most important development, but I think a very important development, and this is something that Beatrice touched on, is the sort of greater focus of the field on finance and the integration of finance with macro, something that I think grows. We're certainly there before, but it grows out of the global financial crisis, and you know, all the calls at the time for macro more generally to worry about financial frictions and financial plumbing. This was not so much of an issue just as the Bretton Woods system collapsed, but you know, the politics, the actions of national governments have brought us to a, you know, to a state where, as has been pointed out, the you know, just the volume of gross capital flows, or on many occasions net capital flows, you know, compared to trade is just huge, and is clearly dominating exchange rate developments. But where there's also a lot of room for malfunctions and for expectations, panic to play a role. It's very telling that, you know, this I did not mention as a legacy, but I think it's an interesting sort of fact, is that it was shortly after the advent of floating rates that the Basel Committee was constituted, and its task has been growing ever larger. It's been supplemented by the Financial Stability Forum, but you know, the sort of catalyst were problems related to exchange rate movements and banks, you know, open positions, time zone differences, things of that sort. So we had this sort of additional source of financial instability, and that is really sort of ballooned. So now finally, after this global financial crisis, we've realized we need to really worry about these as first order macro issues. And one sort of experiment I think that's interesting is sort of look at the table of contents of the successive macro volumes of the Handbook of International Economics, up to the most recent one, which is volume 6. And you'll see that the you know, in this most recent one, sort of more than half of the papers are on sort of deep financial kind of questions, related to financial instability, related to deviations from covered interest parity. Boy, we didn't have those before the global financial crisis. How do we understand those? So I think that's been a sea change, but I think it's a very important one that is going to be very critical for policy makers, both in advanced countries and maybe even more so in the emerging markets.
Thanks. So Rex, we'll move to you.
Again, I'm not sure I can answer your question, but let me make a couple of points. I think one critical question is, why is it that some countries, emerging markets, have a fear of floating? So I think in Maury's original intervention, you know, he talked about capital controls and the trilemma. Well, if you have a fear of floating, you are going to, you know, be in the you'll be stuck in the trilemma, and so you cannot really have open capital accounts or fully open capital accounts. But you know, clearly there are countries that are more affected by their exchange rate movements than others, and I think, you know, that comes into dollar liability, dollarization, and so forth. But sort of more fundamentally, what is it, and what allows a country to graduate from fear of floating to, you know, within reason, no fear of floating? I think that's a very sort of important issue to get a grapple on. On sort of usefulness of models, I mean, I guess there's a question of what do you want to use it for? So I think Giancarlo spoke about how, trade theory and trade models are of no relevance to policy issues on trade. The WTO is just down the street from the Graduate Institute, and it's full of lawyers and not of economists, and certainly not trade economists. And I think the same is true. So Mundell-Fleming, has many limitations, but basically at the IMF, most people are talking or thinking in terms of Mundell-Fleming, or worse, the Pollack model, because they are useful for policy. Most of our micro-founded models, a 10% unemployment rate means we all get Friday afternoon off, whereas in the real world it means 9 of us have a job and 1 person doesn't get to eat. So until we build in these policy relevant frictions and problems in these models, no matter how elegant they are, they're not going to be useful for policymakers. So you got to choose where you want to put your effort. Thanks.
Beatrice?
A short response is I think all the economists who were pushing for moving to floating exchange rate before it happened, they had different models and different motives, but somehow they were thinking that in doing so, they would recover some kind of independence, whether policy independence or financial independence or whatever. And the big takeaway from what happened is that floating exchange requires as much international coordination, cooperation, and that much of the research has been trying to rationalize that and trying to explain that, and it's not fully done yet.
Giancarlo, so.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, Beatrice said one thing that I completely agree, and also Maury. Let me do a positive assessment of the ongoing research, right? So it is not completely true, Rex, that open economy models were just macro models with double the variables with stars, because we were forced to think about heterogeneity when most of the macro was just using a representative age. We had 2 countries, 2 people, 2 technologies. And relative to most of macro, we had relative prices. So many of the insights that came from international were actually, for example, useful in understanding the multi-sector issues raised by COVID, like the famous paper by Lorenzoni and others. So what I'm saying is that there is, let me pick up on something that Beatrice was saying. There is a new wave of research that is trying to integrate better micro and macro evidence, this kind of micro to macro approach. I think this research is still in infancy. There is not much there that we can really say, oh, this is like a leap forward in research. But I think it would be an important takeaway from the end of Bretton Woods, the fact that there is a break in the availability of empirical analysis, and international analysis is particularly useful because we have all this comparative, this heterogeneity. And again, I insist on capital flows, but Maury told the story much better than I could do. Maybe this is something, a research insight that may go ahead, the fact that we need to pay a little bit more attention to the connection and the threads among, stylized facts, information, capital mobility. Now we have the data, we could try to ask new questions on all topics that maybe is the way forward. I'm not sure we are there yet, but it's still like most exporters are multi-product, multi-destination exporters, integrated in input output, in the production chain. Most firms use a lot of finance. They do trade credits, they invest in portfolio, they hold a lot of cash. So all this macro and finance aspect. that translate into employment, translate into competitiveness. By the way, we never mentioned the word competitiveness except for devaluation. That's something that you would be just to remind us that this is another topic in international. I stop here.
Well, thank you for the panel. So I have a question from the audience and also Alexander from the panel behind the panel. So and Cedric, so we'll get to you after I. Rui Esteves was patiently waiting with this question, so I'll read it to you. You can see it in the Q&A, the panelists. But Rui picks up on Giancarlo's observation. I think an observation also made later in this round by Maury, is the current account versus the capital account view of international finance, shifting the focus from the trade, the goods and labor, into more asset markets and balance sheets. And I think that you've spoken to that, and maybe you can perhaps enlighten more about this. And in particular, I'm thinking of how that relates, if I'm picking up on that question, how that relates to all these saving gluts issues and the fact that countries that quote unquote need to run current account deficits in order to invest and go through structural change or assetly driven by basically the sort of the capital account side of the balance of payment and are actually running surpluses and therefore maybe contributing to saving glut and slower growth in some of the lower middle income economies or the middle income economies. So if any of you want to answer that, just feel free to.
Well, I could take a stab at it. I think this question really comes back to what Giancarlo said earlier about stocks and flows, and he's revealing his Yale background when he talks about this stuff. But I think it's very important. And so basically, the current account is a flow, and capital account fluctuations occur largely when people's stock preferences change, right? You know, particularly when you get to a world where financial markets are so big, those stock changes are going to overwhelm in sheer magnitude the flows of the current account, and are going to have a predominant effect on asset prices, including exchange rates. So I don't think there's any contradiction. And I also think that you know, the idea that countries, you know, intertemporally have to be solvent is important and provides a kind of anchor for the long run that, you know, in an ideal rational expectations world would inform these sort of stock decisions. But again, I think part of the shift toward thinking more about the role of finance has been, you know, the resurrection of a concern with this sort of stock flow distinction, which you know, in the very, very early days, like if you look at actually the research that was being done in the early 1970s, there was a whole group of Tobin students who came out of Yale, who went to the Federal Reserve, who did really important work on portfolio balance approaches. And, you know, when Pentti Kuri went to be an assistant professor at Yale, he was infected with this bug also, and, you know, did important work. The very early work that Bill Branson did in Brookings on capital flows tried very hard to distinguish between capital flows basically driven by the trade balance or you know, sort of by the trend growth of wealth throughout the world, and then sharp portfolio shifts. So this kind of thinking has been there from the beginning, but I believe it kind of fell out of disfavor because it was somewhat hard to model in general equilibrium, and other approaches were analytically much easier. But it's certainly coming back now, though not always in large scale sort of general equilibrium models. We still have a lot of sort of stripped down, more partial analyses. But I think eventually this will find its way more into the types of big macro models that central banks use.
May I butt in?
You want to barge in? Okay, you barged in, so.
Okay, no, I would like to butt in because I really enjoyed this discussion about Stan and so on. I may reveal my Yale background too, Maury. Stan Black entered Yale at the same time, the graduate school at the same time as I did. He was also an undergraduate there, I believe. And he finished his PhD a year ahead of me, and he did it in record time. And a lot of that stuff was in his PhD thesis. And it was quite impressive. On that stock adjustment, two remarks. Should I start doing? On stock adjustment, two remarks. One, if you look at all the stuff of Rudy's and so on, basically you go back to Marshall, who distinguished between a market period, a short-run period, and a long-run period. That is, and the idea is some markets adjust more quickly than the others. So in the market period, something goes up very quickly if there is a negative shock to supply. But then as the price rises, the supply adjusts and goes up. And this idea of the slow adjustment of the adjustment, I think, is something that you can already find there. Now, the way Rudy formalized it was interesting, but I think what was also important. The second thing I would say on the type of research we did in what somebody characterized as a Chicago-Geneva, it was not really the Chicago-Geneva approach, it was the LSE Geneva approach. On the empirical work, we used Cliff Weimer's econometric technology, which was basically a stock adjustment technology and not an instantaneous one. And just one other remark on Mundell-Fleming. I think the importance is not, indeed, capital movements are not modeled in there. Indeed, financial markets are sort of implicit and international markets are not explicitly there. But they do make one very important point, which is that interest rates are going to get equalized among countries, and you get this financial interdependence through that, which is very important. And the lesson from that is that what exchange rate regime you have matters a great deal to the transmission mechanism. And I think that basic lesson of the Mundell-Fleming model is extremely important. And those two lessons, if capital is free to move, there is a tendency towards interest rate equalization. Now you have to qualify all that with expectations. And secondly, what exchange rate regime you have matters a great deal on how you want to conduct or how you can conduct monetary policy and fiscal policy for either external balance with slightly different definitions of internal balance. And just to conclude what is probably too long, a little remark. Canada had a floating exchange rate between 1950 and 1962. Bob Mundell was a Canadian. Harry Johnson was a Canadian. Ron McKinnon was a Canadian. There is some relationship between those two and why they thought the way they did. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexandra. So Cedric has his hand up, so you can unmute yourself and.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Nathan. So thanks to all the panelists. That was very interesting. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like I can activate my camera. Anyway, my question was following a point that Giancarlo made, which was, we want to replace model Fleming with another encompassing model. Now there is this, okay, good. There is this push now the MF for the integrated policy framework, and now we have model where we have all the friction in various different market, you get interest premium. I'd be curious to hear the panelist on that, because my impression from reading that and teaching it is that we get a very broad range of possibilities. So it really depends where is your friction, what shock you get. And I have a bit of a hard time of trying to distill like a bottom line out of this. No, maybe reality is multidimensional and there is no way to distill a simple bottom line, and we just have to take each country with its specificities. But I'd be curious to hear the panelists on that. Thanks.
Anyone volunteer to answer?
I hate to volunteer again, but I actually have a strong opinion on that, so
Go ahead.
happy to share it. So I had the privilege to discuss the paper at the NBR Summer Institute a couple of summers ago, and I reacted exactly like you, Cedric. And the analogy I gave to the authors was, with Mead's books, Trade and Welfare and Balance of Payments, but especially the Balance of Payments, where, he looked at every case, every conceivable case. And for years, and I'm sure Alex will remember this, anytime anyone would write a paper, someone would say, oh, it's all in Mead. But nobody really knew what was in Mead because it was impossible to read because there was no bottom line. It was kind of an encyclopedia, but you couldn't get anything really out of it. And then, Mundell comes along, having overlapped with Mead at the LSE, and writes these incredibly beautiful, clear, simple, strong bottom line. So. Clearly, I think the IPF has a lot of important insights, but how the challenge is to sort of deploy it to emphasize some key insights that are really useful for policymakers that don't depend on special, 5 special parameter values being in a particular configuration, and I think until they can kind of distill some more universal rules for policymakers, it's going to be hard to have a real impact. So, what I'm saying is I'm incredibly sympathetic to your point, and I don't know how I would go about following my own advice where I am the author's position, but I think they need to come up with something that is more understandable, palatable, easy to remember, easy to state as a headline.
So see you, Rex, you have your hand up. So
yeah, so let me give you a little background. Of course, these are my own views. I'm not speaking on behalf of the funder when I say these things. So actually, Alexandre mentioned that Canada had a floating exchange rate. And what happened was there were capital inflows coming into Canada, and the fund recommended imposing capital controls in 1950. And then the Canadians said, no, we don't want to. And so, we'll go to a more flexible exchange rate. I may get the year wrong. And the whole IPF is an attempt to soften maybe the fund's views on the use of capital controls and what we call CFMs, capital flow management measures. So in 2012, the IMF came up with this institutional review on capital flow management. And there are 2 diametrically opposite views about that initiative. Some people think the fund became much more permissive in the use of capital controls. Others say, well, according to the articles, countries were free to do so, and in fact, it circumscribes the ability of of countries to impose capital controls. And then we found it was pretty restrictive. So there were measures, in Canada, Australia, and so forth, mostly housing-related measures, which kind of fell afoul of the institutional view. And so then there was an effort to both, maybe clarify when these sorts of measures might be appropriate. And so indeed, the IPF, has a whole bunch of results and it all depends on everything, but that's kind of its purpose, to say, well, okay, maybe this country does meet this configuration and therefore it would be appropriate for them to use certain measures. So in that sense, it's probably quite a useful tool for that purpose. But indeed, as Maury said, it's not like Mundell-Fleming, where every undergraduate can learn the key results in 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Giancarlo.
I also share Cedric frustration with the kind of approaches. Perhaps you are talking about two different things. So one thing is having a very large framework for, as a sort of reference, like myth-wise reference of all possible cases. Another one is a model that can provide a narrative that the people understand, that they sort of map a policy choice in it. So let me say, Cedric and I participated in the revolution of the new open macroeconomics early on, and then new Keynes and stuff. Maybe there is still some kind of clear answer from those models that it may be worth to look at. For example, the question of inefficient capital flows that appreciate the currency and create a deficit. Those models tend to address the question of what would be the first line monetary policy response to it. And it turns out that the first line monetary response to it has quite a bit to do with the role of the change rate, either as a shock absorber in the transmitting the shock to the output gap. Basically, if the change rate responds, the export prices respond to the change rate. So in the case, the monetary policy response is one of leaning against the appreciation because you care about the output gap. If the exchange rate pass through instead is very low, in the case all the change rate still matters, but not for the much as a first order for the composition of demand, but matters for the income. In that case, actually, the response of the change rate is completely different. No, the interest rate is completely different. What I'm saying is that there is still like an unaccomplished job in our side to at least make a simple input for policy reflection coming from the model. So what the new Mundell-Fleming has done is take very seriously the issue of pass-through and the role of the change rate. There is quite a bit of simple, relatively simple bottom lines there that perhaps would be good to push a little bit more. I'm answering also a question from the audience saying, well, if there is dollar pricing, is the change rate not irrelevant? Well, anything that lowers the change rate pass through sort of makes misalignment a little bit less relevant for policymaking, meaning that there are trade-offs. It's still relevant, but the trade-off might be resolved in different ways, no? Either leaning against the misalignment or perhaps trying to lean against the aggregate demand effect of capital inflows, for example. So this is not an answer to maybe to the question, but it's just to say that we cannot match the beauty of the Mendel Fleming for good reasons, but we can still have a bit of a survey of good things that came out from the last 20 years of research, which should be useful inputs for policy without going into the complexity of the integrated framework.
Okay, so I think we have exhausted our allotted time. Time flies when we're having fun, and I think it was a very lively discussion. And I think that the end of our discussion here with the IPF and the question by Sadiq and your answers is an excellent lead to next week's installment of the series that looks at sort of what do we do from now, how do we move on. And just by way of an anecdote to end the evening, when I was the head of the research department and NBC member with Stan Fisher, and we started the interventions in the foreign exchange market, we were flying blind in terms of research and theory, and it would be interesting in hindsight to look at these things with new development of literature. So I think that's going to be discussed next week, and I thank you all, the audience and the panelists for a very insightful and thought-provoking discussions, and see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.